Welcome to the People's Revolution podcast. This is a space where we share stories from activists around the world. We hope that these stories inspire you to act locally as we care globally.
I don't have a problem with you. Generation, look around, there's nothing left to do. Liberation, take one final step and then you'll see the complication. System don't belong to you or me.
Welcome to the People's Revolution podcast. Today we are going to start the show in a different way, and this is something that I should have been doing this whole time, a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are important because the land that we are on is stolen, and a land acknowledgement is the first step in recognizing whose land this actually is. If we are not honest about colonization, we cannot create reconciliation for it. So, I would like to recognize that we are on stolen land, rightfully the home of Blackfoot Nations, now home of Treaty 7. This land is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nations, where the Siksikatsippi lived and practiced their oral traditions as far back as existence goes. These nations are Siksika, Kainai, Piikani. Treaty 7 was signed on September 22, 1877 between John McDougall and the nations of Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Stoney Nation, and Tsuut'ina in a brutally unethical way. These nations were promised peace and protection of their rights. This treaty was not upheld. Instead, they experienced brutal genocide, forced removal, and ethnic cleansing. Today, Treaty 7 includes the nations of Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda, and Métis Nation Region 3. So, in short, this show is coming to you from what should be known as Mohkinstsis. Today, we have Stacey Mee on the show. Stacey is a new Chinook and Anishinaabe woman whose first activism experience was at age 3. Her activism is present within her classroom as a high school teacher and in her daily life. Her activism currently works towards supporting the underrepresented in the Okanagan and pushing for a safe world for all people. Stacey, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Julia.
I'm excited to have you. So I just want to dive right in and talk about you. I would love to hear your story, what brought you to activism, what happened at 3 years old to bring you in.
Okay. Well, 3 years old, I have not full memory, obviously, but I remember being with my Nanisk, my grandfather, out on the West Coast, and we were blockading around salmon fishing. So I obviously didn't understand the significance so much at 3 years old. What I do remember is actually knowing that we had to save the salmon, knowing that they were at risk because of overfishing and unethical fishing of non-Indigenous people, specifically corporations. I didn't understand corporations at the time, but that's what it was looking back. As well as I remember the fear of standing there, being surrounded by RCMP and being surrounded by non-Indigenous people. And I remember them yelling really hateful words and just fear of getting harmed while I was there at 3 years old, which I did not, but that was my start. That was where it all started. It's been on and off since then, mostly on. And trying to find where I fit and where my teachings and traditions fit into activism. We are warriors. We fight for those who can't fight for themselves. We fight for the land. With that said, we need to do it in a way that is as non-harmful as possible. I like to say that I am an activist in the sense of nonviolence. With that said, sometimes violence can happen, and that's the reality. So I try every day to sort of walk that line between fighting my absolute hardest without causing harm beyond what's already there. So that's a little bit about me.
Yes, that's so important. Honestly, what you're saying is so important. I would like to know a little bit more about your personal activism and what drives you today.
What drives me today is so much. One is just watching the absolute rape of our earth. We as Indigenous people, it's not just that we have a relationship with the land we're from and on, it's that we are the land that we are on. And so as the land gets destroyed, it's also killing us, both metaphorically, but also it is literally killing us. It's taking away food sources, especially in this time of COVID. It's taking away clean drinking water. It's taking away access to our own communities. And that is what drives me every day. As well, another big driver is just the amount of missing and murdered Indigenous women and queer folk that exist, and the silence that surrounds it in what is now called Canada.
Yes. Again, so important. So important. What has that journey been like for you?
It's been up and down. It's exhausting, right? So not letting yourself get taken over by the sorrow, not worrying about being targeted by law enforcement because of what we do. So one of the things specifically with Indigenous land back, and there's the water protectors, there's tiny house warriors, our land back warriors. What we do is often considered illegal. And you can get arrested for it. Many people have been arrested for it. I have in the past, not in the recent activism, but I have in the past. And us blockading and protecting our own land is considered up to a felony offense. And so we do put ourselves at risk. So the rail blockades, which were very effective all over Canada, we shut the rail system down. I don't remember for how long, but it was a significant period of time. In the media, we got portrayed as terrorists. We got portrayed as extremists. Most, if not all of the people out there blockading were actually just Indigenous people protecting our homes. And it was, people said, well, why not negotiate? Why not try to do this the right way, quote unquote. And one of the things that people don't recognize is that we have gone through the colonizers' systems. We have gone to the Supreme Court to fight for our land rights. We have, and the rights of our land. We've gone through letter writing and asking for meetings with government officials. We have done all of that and nothing ever happens. We actually have won several cases in the Supreme Court of BC and Canada that clearly states that this land that's being protected is our land. This is the rights to this land. It's protected not only under colonized ways, such as the Proclamation of 1763 and the lack of treaty signing. It's also just protected by the laws of the land, and this is our land, and we know those laws. So we tried to do it through the colonizer way and through the colonizer's legal system. And it doesn't matter if we win lawsuits, we still have corporations, primarily oil and gas, coming in, destroying land, destroying actual physical homes and healing centers, taking out trap lines where people make their sustenance daily, and taking people's lives, and walking in on ceremony and the RCMP arresting elders during ceremony in these locations. And so we did everything we could the way that we are told to do by colonizers, and it still didn't work. And this worked to some extent. The fight is still going on all across what is now called Canada. And one of the things that happened, and I apologize, I'm probably going to say this incorrectly, but I will try my best, is the Wet'suwet'en up in northern BC, there was negotiations agreed to. It was supposed to stop the construction of the pipeline up there. So unfortunately, COVID kicked in, and those negotiations have been stalled since then. And the corporation is still in there destroying the land. So it's hard to really figure out what to do next, because we get arrested if we try to protect. We win court battles, but they're not followed through on. And so really that's what activism, I think that was your question, I'm trying to get back to it, is what activism looks like now. And that journey is every time I'm out there, myself and everybody else out there has to think about the legal aspect of it, the safety aspect of it. At one blockade I was at, there was people driving past with tow hitches and throwing them at us, calling us words that I will not say on here. And the tow hitch is in reference to the woman who got killed by a tow hitch a couple of years ago. And so it's a direct threat on our lives when that happens. So it is difficult. And sometimes it's nicer to do some of the activism this way, through education, through podcasts, through Zoom events, in classrooms. So I try to balance it for mental health purposes and legal purposes as well.
Yes. But what do you think that the biggest misconception about the activism that you do is?
I think the biggest misconception is that we're violent. I watch, like, you even look at what happened in Oka in the 90s, and we were portrayed as these very, very violent people. Often at these activism, especially the land back and water protectors, there are not weapons allowed there. We do not allow weapons on that land, because it is ceremonial. The protests themselves, the blockades, they're all ceremonial, and weapons aren't allowed. In Oka, there was weapons, but remembering that people were protecting their own lives and their land there as well. But the media always portrays us as just these, to use the term often used for our people, savages. And that's the biggest misconception. We are out there in peace and love and trying to protect. And we're not just protecting for ourselves. We're protecting for anybody that lives on this land. Once it's gone, it's gone.
I want to ask you a dual question.
Okay.
What makes you the most angry about this, and what makes you the most hopeful about this?
Okay, so I think what makes me the angriest is the ongoing ignorance of a very large majority of people in so-called Canada. And some of the ignorance is just that they don't know what they don't know. But there's so much ignorance that's chosen. People don't want to know the truth. They don't want to learn the truth. They want to see us in our beads and feathers, and that's all they care about us as Indigenous people. So I get really angry. I also get really angry when one of our people gets killed or murdered, and it's always justified as something we've done wrong, whether it's Colton Boushie being shot and murdered, and no charges happening, and it being said, well, he was trespassing. Well, that's not a reason to murder somebody. Or Chantel Moore out in the east, she's a Nuu-chah-nulth woman, and shot during a wellness check 5 times. And the body cam was turned off, and justifying that through she was dangerous because she had a knife. Well, that to me is not justification. So just, it always seems to get turned back. And it's the same with my Black brothers and sisters. Is as soon as one of us are killed, everybody goes on a hunting spree to find out what we've done wrong and how it's our own fault. And so that angers me, and it disheartens me, and it makes me emotional, and sometimes it gets to the point where it can be paralyzing, like the sorrow over watching this happen to our people. What gives me hope, we'll look at the positive. What gives me hope is the amount of people who are coming forward and asking for support and education, who are wanting to learn, who are wanting to listen, who are stepping up and being allies. We have seen it more in the Black Lives Matter movement than in the Land Back movement, with mass amounts of allies in the Black Lives Matter movement. Land Back, we are still not seeing that very much, but it's getting there. It's getting a little bit better. And also what gives me hope is the coming together of those two movements, actually, because there was a long time where, just because of colonization and because of the way things are set up, us as Indigenous people and people of the Black Lives Matter movement didn't necessarily work together. It was often a oppression Olympics, and we're not doing that anymore. And that gives me a lot of hope. The first time I saw that was during Standing Rock, when Black Lives Matter showed up at Standing Rock to show their full support. So things like that give me a lot of hope.
Yeah. What would you say to activists that are just getting into things right now but are a little timid? Or allies. Okay, so I think it's two different things. Some of it's the same, but for Indigenous youth starting to get into activism, or Indigenous adults starting to get into activism, is always remember to celebrate and be in touch with what we're actually fighting for. So if it's a land back movement, make sure you're spending time on the land in sacred ceremonies and really remembering and connecting, not always fighting. Make sure that you have that time of healing as well. I would, especially for Indigenous youth, I would say make sure you're smudging and participating in daily traditional activities as well. And look to people that are older to you to support you, and let them know when you're not sure what to do. That's what I would say. For allies coming in, I'd say make sure that you're not centering. We are all guilty of it at different times, so I'm not innocent in that. But really checking yourself as an ally, whether it's an ally to Indigenous people, ally to Black people, ally to trans people, or the queer community in any way. Make sure that you are not speaking for them. You can speak to your fellow white folks or straight folks and say, hey, that's not okay, you shouldn't do that, and this is why. But never speak in the sense of the Indigenous community says this, or the Black community says this, or the queer community says this. So really making sure that you're not centering yourself and you're not trying to speak, and in the process eliminating the voice of those who are marginalized. Like to only speak to your own community.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Without paraphrasing.
Yeah. And I think also recognizing, like, we as Indigenous people don't all have the same views, or in any community, right? Like the oil and gas industry is one of probably the most interesting ones. Is there are several of us who are fighting against what oil and gas does, because 93% of pipelines are through Indigenous land, which is an issue.
Oh, 93. Eh?
Yeah, when non-Indigenous people have pipelines proposed to go through their land, they've often argued it, and then so the companies have moved it without having to go to court and moved it onto Indigenous land.
Oh.
So, yeah, so I am obviously, yes, I use oil and gas. That is the world we live in. I will just throw that out there. But I am very much against that being our sole future and our sole present for energy.
Yes.
But there are several Indigenous people who work in oil and gas and are very pro oil and gas. So recognizing that not everybody in a community feels the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And we have differences, and that's okay because we are not a monolith group.
Yes. And we can participate in a society while still critiquing it. That's very important.
Yes.
Oh, that's so important.
Oh, it's very important because I get a lot of, well, then stop heating your house and stop doing this and stop doing that. And it's like, well, okay, but we need to find the alternate energies first. So let's reinvest money into alternate energies. And on top of that, let's do true consultation with Indigenous people and don't put contracts out to sign to starving communities and expect that that's consent.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Makes sense. What is your message to people that don't understand the gravity of the situation in totality?
That's always a hard one, right? Like I try to educate, I try to explain best I can in a kind and understanding way. I feel like those who don't get the gravity at this point perhaps don't want to get the gravity. And I will forever stand and block against those people hurting others. I will not spend my energy trying to educate them when they don't care to be educated. So I feel like unless you're living it, you don't necessarily fully understand the gravity. But I believe at this point, especially with the rise of the civil rights movement again, people get to some degree that it's serious issues that we're talking about. And yeah, if they don't at this point, it's because of choice. And I will fight against them, but I will not waste my energy trying to educate them unless they ask me to educate them.
That's a really good answer.
Yeah. That took some learning and exhaustion.
Yeah. I find sometimes with activism, I feel like I'm running on a hamster wheel with a megaphone trying to be like, pay attention. And
yes.
Doesn't go very far. So that's really good. Actually.
It doesn't. And it can send you into a really negative mind space. And I find myself in those places still. And then I have to check myself and be like, whoa, like, let's not engage with that because people playing the devil's advocate don't care to learn.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, that is so true. What would reconciliation look like if you could have, if you could paint it?
Am I allowed to say everybody go back to where they came from?
You are.
No, I won't say that.
No, you
because I feel like that'll get used as an anti-immigrant thing by people who are anti-immigrant, and I don't actually believe that. I say it facetiously, but
okay.
One of the things I would say is that reconciliation to me is so much a buzzword at this point. And I've talked about that in the past, even though I still push those TRC calls to action and am hopeful that something will happen. Reconciliation's become a buzzword. And I think what's happened with that is that it has forgotten about the truth portion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think it's also forgotten about the fact that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a starting point for reconciliation. And we haven't even started the starting point yet. So how does reconciliation work? Well, I unfortunately don't think I will see it in my lifetime, and I don't think my daughter will see it in hers. But what it would look like is people honoring and respecting the land they're on, honoring and respecting the people that are on and from that land, their stories, their traditions, their way of being, and it would become the norm of society, would be the Indigenous way, and not the colonized way. So I would see a completely different government. I would see a completely different justice system. I would see a completely different education system. And it would all be working in harmony with the land that each person is on. So like what would be right for here in the Okanagan is not what would be right for there in Calgary.
That makes sense. And if people don't like it, they can go back. I'm just kidding. I would like to actually, what you said, truth and reconciliation, the calls to action, I would like to talk about that for a little bit. Because I think that's so important, because so many people say we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. We just need to know what to do. And that is exactly what that is.
Yes. So there's something about the I don't know what to do, and you see it a lot in the education system, because we are supposed to be incorporating Indigenous ways in the education system out here in BC. I know Alberta is a little different, but out in BC, we're supposed to be incorporating Indigenous ways. And I hear it so often, but I don't know where to start and I don't know what to do. And I think that's an excuse. I'll be completely honest. I don't think that is the reality. I think that is a reason for people not to do anything. Because there are books that are written by Indigenous people. There are the TRC calls to action that are, you can read the shortened version in a half a day. The longer version, the books, will take significantly longer, but everything is out there. All the information on how to do this is out there. It doesn't mean you have to go and change everything all at once, but you read a book and you go, oh, okay, I can do this little piece or that little piece. And it's the same in all the activism movements, right? Like, it's, the information's out there. So if somebody's saying, I don't know where to start, just do it. Just start. Mm-hmm. I don't have a better answer for that except for just start. Yeah.
And if you don't know where to start, read the truth and reconciliation.
Yes, there are 94 calls to action. Only 10 of them have been completed. And I would actually argue that none of them have been actually completed, but 10 are to the level that the government feels is completed. There are 84 left. And although a lot of them are calls to government and a lot of them are calls to education systems, we all partake in all aspects of this society in some way, shape, or form. So take a part that you participate in and work towards it, and insist others work towards it, and find which calls make sense and incorporate those calls when you're writing letters to municipalities or to government officials or to companies. It's not hard.
Yes. And you know what? I personally didn't know that there was different versions of these calls to action, because I only recently learned about the one that was, I can't remember if it was for Calgary or for Alberta, but it was called the white goose flying calls to action.
Yes. So there are some nations who have put forward things more specific. Mm-hmm. Yes. Not a lot, but there are some. Yeah. And it's important to look local, right? So what is relevant, again, what is relevant for there in Calgary is not necessarily relevant here in the Okanagan or relevant where my nation is out on the island. Part of it is treaty and lack of treaty. Part of it is history. We all have, as Indigenous peoples, we all have a similar history in a lot of ways, but there's also a lot of differences that people don't recognize that really impact how our lives play out.
Mm-hmm. So if you could pick a social system to change today, if you just said the word and it was done, what social system would that be?
It's so hard, but I feel like this is the starting point is the child and welfare system. I mean, all of them have to be changed, but I feel like that is the starting point to injustice now, currently in our society. I feel that babies getting taken away at the hospital, or children being removed for reasons that they would not be removed from a non-Indigenous home, leads to these levels of poverty, and to the being unhoused, and to being involved in the justice system, and to poor education, and not knowing when to fight in the education system, and all of those pieces. So I think if we could change one immediately, that would be my first pick.
I was going to ask, what would you like to replace it with? But probably not replace that.
Definitely not in the way it is now. I mean, there are children of all background who the home is not a safe place for them, and that's the reality. And there needs to be a safe place for children to be. So something still needs to exist, but what exists now was set up to destroy Indigenous people, and other communities of color are also overly impacted by the foster care system. Immigrant families specifically have almost as high a rate of abduction of their children as Indigenous people. I shouldn't say immigrants. Immigrants of color have almost as high of an abduction of their children, and less interventions. So less community supports being offered when there is something going on. So many kids are abducted from their families because their families live in poverty, so they don't have proper housing or proper food. That is not fixed by removing a child.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So a better overall system would support a removal of this system.
Yes.
And from what I understand, and please stop me if I'm wrong, but the child welfare system is an extension or continuation of residential schools.
Yeah, and some would disagree with me on that, but yes, 100%, right? We had residential schools, we had the 60 scoop. Those two were overlapped. The 60 scoop was the removal of Indigenous children adopted out to white families, sometimes sold to white families. And there was no oversight of what happened to these kids once they were sent into these other families. Some were used as house slaves. And this is current. There's evidence of this in the 90s.
Last residential school closed in 1996?
Sure did, yeah. And so the 60 scoop was that overlap, right? The schools started closing in mass in the 70s. Some of them still stayed open, but when they started closing in mass in the 70s, they just started taking the kids away for adoption. And again, often these kids became house servants is what they became. So the family's biological children would be treated as children, and these other children were not. They were enslaved, and the foster care system was around at like the same time, really being more apparent, and they kind of go hand in hand, right? It's devastating, and different foster care systems work in different ways, but because there is no federal oversight of the foster care system, one of the issues can be that if a family changes provinces, a foster family changes provinces, any reports that have been made prior to then, not charges, those are different, but any reports that are made against that family disappear as soon as they change to a different child and family services. So there isn't a federal bank for that. And there are good foster families out there, but a foster family is never as good as creating a space in a home that is safe for a child, where they get to stay with family, whether that's parents or aunties or grandparents, cousins. There's all different ways.
That makes sense. Keeping things in the community rather than having a a colonized system force its way into these issues that it created itself.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there are going to be the odd time where there isn't a place in the community for a child, but those places are rare, and that should not be the norm. Currently, in many of the provincial jurisdictions, I don't have my list in front of me, but many of the provincial jurisdictions for family and child and family services are a apprehension funding model. So what that means is they get funding for apprehensions, not for supports put in place. So, and it's most of the provinces follow that. So for any child, even non-Indigenous children, the money from the government is given to child and family services upon abduction of a child, or apprehension is the term they like to use. And for Indigenous children, it's more money. So that is an issue. There should be more funding for initiating supports and resources than apprehension, without question. But yeah, our current child and family services works on an apprehension model.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
Didn't know that. That's wow.
Yeah.
All of this encompassing, it is really, I don't want to say overwhelming, because it is what it is, but
yeah.
To look at it as like a totality of it's so many things caused by, I want to say, colonization, and continue to be perpetuated by colonization. And so it almost seems like you go up against everything that this society has.
Absolutely. And that, because our what is referred to as Canada is based on colonization. All of our policies, all our procedures, all of our systems here on this land currently that are considered legitimate by the vast majority of people were all put in place for the purpose of colonization. They haven't changed. They're still the same systems, and they're still doing their job, which is the attempted genocide of Indigenous people. And I would argue also the attempted genocide of Black people and other people of color. So, because the systems are set up in a way that it is, every time you take a step ahead, something knocks you back. And the class system plays a role in that. So of course, there's a higher rate of poverty in Black, Indigenous, and immigrants of color. And that causes so many barriers just in and of itself, right? So it's such a huge system, and we have to just keep fighting. And what I would argue is I want to see as many people out to fight against this. I don't even know what to call it, because it's beyond racism, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because it's also destroying the land. It's also destroying everything, right? And so we need to have people out there. And if you see a land back movement, or the tiny house warriors are setting up a blockade, don't just show up. I'm not saying that. Check first. But even if they're saying, especially right now during COVID, they don't want a lot of outsiders because we don't want it spreading in our communities. But where can you send donations to? Can you send a delivery of food up to these people who are doing the work? Can you raise awareness in your own community? Can you start a rally in your own community? I was trying to organize a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women March for May 5th, which is Red Dress Day here, across what's referred to as Canada, and there's nothing here, nothing. So something like this needs to be nationwide. It needs to be awareness. There needs to be people coming out. And again, with COVID, it's harder. I understand, but you can do local rallies and movements safely. We've been doing it through this entire pandemic and haven't spread COVID because we take the proper safety protocols, right? So we need people to stand up against this. It's hard because those of us who are doing it often by ourselves are exhausted, and we need help.
Yeah. And I'll just throw this in there for people listening that as a white person going through this, you're going to hit so many ignorant, like you're going to be like, oh shit. And you just gotta be okay with that. And it's like, I say that just because I know people that have given up, because this is overwhelming, and this is awkward, and this is terrible, and this is all these things. But it's personal responsibility without taking it fully personally.
Yes.
Please stick with it.
Yes. Yeah. And I know it, I see when people aren't used to experiencing this racism every day of their lives. And I'm going to throw out there and recognize first off, that I get to avoid it if I want. I am very much white passing. I hate that term, but I am. And if I don't want to live in my truth, I can avoid all of this. Not every person has that privilege, and we need to recognize that as well, right? So I don't personally feel like I have the privilege to step back, because these are my sisters and brothers and cousins being murdered out there every day. It's my land being raped every day, and my women and men being raped every day. And so I don't feel like I have the privilege to step back. But I do have the privilege of walking down the street and people often not recognizing I'm Indigenous. And so I don't have to listen to the things being thrown at my cousins and my brothers and sisters who are darker than I am. So I do have that privilege. I would love the allies to recognize that they have that privilege and then beyond some. So they don't have the historical legacies. They don't have the they don't have their sisters and brothers being murdered and killed because of their race. Again, recognizing that you may be going through all of that as an ally. You might be in an abusive relationship, or you may have been in a terribly toxic family, or you may have relatives who have committed suicide or been murdered. So I'm not taking away from your own trauma, but recognizing that we're talking about an entire group of people that this is happening to. So if you are Indigenous, or you are Black, or you are a person of color, this happens all the time, and you have to fear it happening to you because of who you are and how you're born.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very powerful. Thank you. I wanted to end it. I always try and end it with what progress has been made so far and positivity, but I feel like we can do that, but I also just want to be stressing that this situation is beyond things that we can even explain in this 45-minute clip. And even if there's some progress being made, like you were saying, Stacey, you wouldn't even say 10 of the truth and reconciliation calls to action have even been fulfilled, even though they have been fulfilled. So I don't know so totally this is a question that no. But is there any progress that you feel has been successful in what we call Canada, or what we call Western Canada?
I would say, so in my individual life, I get to see little progresses. Things like where I work, recognizing light bulbs going on about the idea of decolonization. And how it differentiates the difference of it, sorry, I couldn't get the right word there. The difference of it than just indigenization, which is just bringing in Indigenous bits here and there. Decolonization is restructuring the entire system, right? Dismantling and starting over. And so in my workplace, I've had the privilege of being able to see those little progresses because I have bosses who listen and think and recognize that reality. I have not always worked in a workplace where that is the case, though. So I'm lucky enough to see these small progresses. I'm also lucky enough to see the benefit of it for my Indigenous youth that I work with. So I get to celebrate those little things, which makes getting through so much easier and so much more hopeful. With that said, if I look at the systemic aspect of it, there has been little to no progress. And so it's this weird little thing, right? That I'm trying to find these little pockets of hope without ignoring that true systemic change has not really moved very far as of yet. I mean, we have an inquiry into the treatment of Indigenous people in the healthcare system here in BC. Finally, but it was based off people dying in the healthcare system in BC, and then a group of nurses making bets of blood alcohol level of Indigenous patients coming into the hospital, becoming a public thing. And that is why we have an inquiry into it. It took that for there to be an inquiry into it. So there are little things, and I try to hang on to those and get hopeful. And I get little pockets of happiness over these little accomplishments. But I really want people to recognize this is a systemic issue, and we got to keep fighting. And it's not, we're not going to see this massive change in our lifetime. I wish we would, but just remember to like keep fighting, even if you don't see the massive change, and reach out and be part of a community that's also fighting, because then you get those positive pieces.
Yes. Yeah. I find it's like the toughest part is getting through to people who have just fully, I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, anyone listening, I'm sorry, but like anyone who went through our education system and was taught we are a melting pot, like I just hear melting pot as like a dog whistle, it's not a real, that just means colonization to me now.
Yes.
But when I was learning it in school, I was like, that makes so much sense. But like as an adult, I'm like, that's fucked.
Yeah. And we see it in things like, because we are considered multicultural in Canada and not a melting pot, right? The US is melting pot, we're multicultural.
Okay.
But we see it, it's the same fucking thing. But you look at multicultural, and how do we celebrate it? We celebrate it through these really amazing events, don't get me wrong, where we see each other's cultures and our dance and our regalia and our food, and we celebrate those, and I enjoy those celebrations. But that's it. That's where it ends. And so it's like, okay, you get one day, all people who are Indigenous or Black or immigrant families, you get this one day to show everybody what the nice things about your history and culture. And now we've done our job, and now Canada's multicultural. But like you said, that idea of multiculturalism is about, and especially melting pot, it's about turning all the rest of us into the European way, but only enough that we're not an inconvenience, not enough so that we're equal. Same idea as assimilation, right? Assimilation is actually about extinction. It's not about getting people to fit into a community. It's about making them extinct from the larger community.
That makes sense. And it makes unfortunate sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so difficult to talk about because it is the whole system, like the entire thing that came in and was like, I'm in charge now, I'm bringing the RCMP, we're going to enforce all this crap. And like, without knowing that, like, that's not something I learned in elementary school, high school. That's something I learned as an adult. And I can see the harm that it's caused. But learning as a kid, and if no one teaches, if you don't seek this out as a white person, I would just be enforcing the system just by living my everyday life. And that scares the shit out of me, to be honest.
Yeah. And that's it, right? It's not about, I don't hate white people, right? Like I don't. I think that is also a misconception you just, we hate the white system, mm-hmm. right? And I think recognizing that and the positive in that is if we hate the white system, we can all be fighting that, mm-hmm. right? There are very few activists who will say to a white ally, we don't want you here. Very few. None that I know of in what is referred to as Western Canada. Although there may be, yeah. But those that I have encountered, that has not been the case, right? So recognizing we're fighting a system here and we can't be fighting each other. We need to be working together no matter what our background and knowing where our place and our role in that is. Mm-hmm. Like even within Inclusive Canada, we've got an array of cultural backgrounds, right? Just between four of us and we work together to fight the system. And I think that's important to recognize is that's what we're fighting. And we can keep doing that. And people shouldn't be scared to do that. And it's okay to show up at a Black Lives Matter rally if you're white and you know nobody, and I know it's probably scary, but still show up, and you will be shocked probably if you're going in scared at how welcomed you are into the community. And just show up and be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, show up, learn. Decolonization starts right here.
It sure does. Yeah, it absolutely does. And decolonization is a scary thing. Because it means getting rid of all of our systems, but it's a hopeful thing, right? It's like if we didn't have these systems in place, and it doesn't matter what background you're from, unless you're the 1% upper class that's super privileged and has no barriers. Imagine if all these systems just like were thrown out and we got to dream about what next. And make it in a way that's about being honest and true and people having courage and having love and having all of those things present. Like that's better for everybody. So if you start to feel kind of like down on it or scared about it, just take that time to like look at the what ifs. Like what could this land be if we just started over?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
One final question. What is your final statement for the people?
My final statement, I think, would be although this is heavy, although it can bring you to tears daily to look into these issues and to really understand the numbers of people who are impacted by this and recognize they're not just data, they're human beings. And I know it's tough, and I know it, no matter whether you are an ally or you are Indigenous, it is difficult to know these. As an Indigenous person, if you're listening, it can make you feel unsafe and make you want to lock yourself in your house on the reserve and never leave. But remember that there's a lot of us out there who can create a community of hope and can support each other when we are feeling completely done with the world, and reach out to those people. Surround yourself with the people that can lift you up when you're down and who you can lift up when they're down. And we might not see it in our lifetime, but 6 generations from now, which will be the post residential school generation, their lives will be better. And if we hang on to that and keep fighting for this change, it'll happen. So just, surround yourself with people that you love and care about and who are good for you. And it'll make this happen, and it'll make this bearable.
Mm-hmm. That's perfect. Thank you so much, Stacey. I appreciate you. And thank you again for being on the show. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you, Julia.